1 Timothy 3:3. What he must be to be my pastor, I guess I have part 4 now, part 4. So we're kind of going through this maybe what I call a mini-series on what he must be to be my pastor. And we've considered the state of affairs in the church today. We've considered the plethora of unqualified spiritual leaders, the moral failures, the compromise, the lack of training, the lack of wisdom. And it is so vital that pastors be qualified according to what God says. Now, 1 Timothy, you've heard this statement over and over and over again. You'll hear this statement over and over and over again because I don't want you to miss it. 1 Timothy is a letter written by a pastor and to a pastor and really for pastors. And yet it's also for everyone. It's for the entire congregation of God's people to study and to examine and to even hold their pastors accountable. In this letter, Paul writes about the need for pastors to protect against false doctrine. And one of the best ways to do that, one of the best ways for a church to protect against false doctrine is to appoint pastors who are biblically qualified. A biblically qualified pastor needs to have a passion for the work of the Lord. That's the start. That's not the ending point. It's the starting point. He has to have a passion in order to handle the difficulties that ministry brings. He needs to be above reproach. He needs to be a one-woman man because he's in a place of trust with women. He needs to be sober-minded. That is, he needs to take ministry seriously and the job of being a pastor seriously, the calling of being a pastor seriously. He needs to have a strong level of self-control because he's surely going to be in positions where other people don't control themselves. He needs to be respectable, hospitable. He needs to be able to teach the Word of God, which implies training. It implies study. It implies all of the character matters of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 that really allow a person to effectively teach. Today, we look at some disqualifiers, some things that disqualify a person from the work of the ministry. 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 3. 1 Timothy 3. It is a trustworthy statement. If any man desires the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate or sober-minded, prudent or self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine, or pugnacious. We'll talk about what that means. But gentle, peaceable, not quarrelsome, free from the love of money. The first disqualifier in verse 3 is that he is not addicted to wine. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this. This word is often translated not a drunkard. Now the scriptures regularly speak about this in other places. Proverbs speaks about it in a very specific way. Proverbs 20, I quote this verse all the time. I quoted it just the other day. I was talking to someone. Proverbs 20 and verse 1, wine is a mocker. Strong drink is raging, and whoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Now, that's a quote of Proverbs 20 and verse 1. And the Old Testament word for wine is yayin. So remember the passage where Jesus says, it's Matthew 5, not one jot or tittle, right, will pass from this law until all is fulfilled. I think it's Matthew 5. I think it's around verses 17 through 20. Right at the very, very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, that jot in Hebrew is a yod. Okay, the tittle is just kind of like this little piece of a Hebrew letter. So not one yod. The word yayin it's a yod, and it's a nun. That's basically, like in English, it's kind of like a Y, and an N. All right? And it's translated in these ways. Wine, grape juice, vineyard, grapes, and so on. So you can translate this word a whole bunch of different ways, but English Bibles almost always translate that word, yayin, almost always translates that word, wine, regardless of context. And I would say that's not prudent. I would say that in the translations, oftentimes, those are translators who are not making interpretive decisions. They're just essentially translating this word the same way every time. And they do the same thing with baptize, by the way. The word baptizo in the New Testament is always translated baptize, but there's no interpretive decision that's made. The word actually means to immerse, to submerge, to dip. Well, with this word, that's what it is. It's almost always translated as wine. Well, anyway, in Proverbs 20 and verse 1, wine is a mocker. Strong drink is raging. And whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. How would you translate that? Would that be talking about grape juice? Grape juice is a mocker. You think that's great? No, it's not. What about vineyard? Vineyard is no. I mean, it's pretty clear in context that this is talking about alcoholic wine. Proverbs goes on to say that wine is not for kings and princes. Proverbs 31, 4 through 5 say this. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Now, why is it to drink wine? Why do you think that's the case in this passage? Anyone have anything on that? You have to shout real loud. You're all under the tree. No one? Very nice. That's good. Is that real loud out there, guys? Is that super loud, what you heard? No? That was perfect. So it doesn't cloud.
Joseph doesn't cloud their judgment.
You might get on the recording if it's working right now. So it doesn't affect their leadership. It doesn't cloud their judgment. It doesn't affect their judgment. It doesn't affect even their spirituality. Right? It says, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Now, if a king was given to wine, if a king should not be given to wine, surely a pastor should not be either. If a political leader is told to avoid wine, then so should the leader of a church, a spiritual leader of a church. That just kind of makes sense. The spiritual nature of the office of an overseer, of a pastor, would demand that. If a political leader's judgment would be clouded or affected by wine, then certainly a pastor's would be. Even the Old Testament priesthood was told to avoid drinking alcohol. Listen to this, Ezekiel 44:21. Nor shall any of the priests drink wine when they enter the inner court. Now, when we looked at the story of Nadab and Abihu, wine was part of that story. Wine was part of that account that really led to them or was part of them introducing strange fire in the altar on the opening day of the tabernacle. If the Old Testament priesthood was to avoid wine, like Ezekiel 44:21 says, surely New Testament pastor should as well. The Apostle Paul shows this principle that Proverbs speaks of several times, Ezekiel speaks of several times, other passage scriptures in the Old Testament. He shows this principle to be timeless. It's enforced in the Old Testament and it's reinforced in Paul's writings in the New Testament. Proverbs goes on to speak of the strong temptation that alcohol could have. Listen to this, Proverbs 23:31 and 32. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Before I got saved, I lived like any lost person would live. And I partied, and I used various substances when I was 17 and 18 years old. And when I got saved, I remember I'd see a commercial on TV. I'd see like a Coors Light in a bottle. And I'd see the bottle beating up. Am I making you guys hopefully I'm not making you thirsty for beer. But I'd see the bottle, what's that called? Beating up, sweating, right? You understand what I'm saying? Like I'd see a sweaty bottle of beer and I'd be tempted. I would be really tempted. And I'd just be like, Roxanne, you might even remember, oh man, Coors Light in a bottle. You know, I'd see that beady bottle of beer because it sparkled in the cup for me. Of course, it didn't take me long to kind of get over that. Now I get tempted over like a non-alcoholic strawberry daiquiri or something like that, strawberry smoothie or an iced coffee or something like that. That looks good to me, or a cold glass of water. But there was a day in my life where I was tempted, where I looked on the, not wine so much, but I looked on the wine when it was red, when it sparkled in the cup, when it went down smoothly. There was that temptation of sin, and we're told to resist that temptation because it is damaging to our spiritual growth. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. There are other passages in Proverbs I'm not quoting here of a man whose senses are dulled and who at the end just asks for another drink. I don't know how the old phrase goes, but something like a man takes a drink, drink takes the man, something like that, right? Paul's already written this principle to the Ephesian congregation about alcohol in Ephesians 5:18. He says, "Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, wherein is excess," is, I think, how the King James. Unfortunately, the King James idea there kind of makes us think that you shouldn't be getting drunk excessively. But the idea is that getting drunk with wine is excess. Getting drunk with wine is debauchery. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. And Paul, who wrote those words to that Ephesian congregation, is writing this letter to the pastor of that same congregation only a few years later. By the way, the Greek word for wine in Ephesians 5:18 is oinos. And that also can mean a variety of things. It can mean unfermented grape juice, like Welch's, like when we buy Welch's. It could mean alcoholic wine. It can be vine, vineyard, or even grape. Again, English translations almost always translate it as wine, regardless of context. The words for wine, I would often say, are not translated. They're kind of almost transliterated. They just take the Greek or the Hebrew words and just kind of transliterate them, just kind of make those words into English, make those letters in English letters. And so the Bible at times speaks positively about quote-unquote wine, and then it speaks negatively about quote-unquote wine, right? We see that wine is a blessing and that wine is a mocker. Okay, and it's unfortunate that we see that in our English translations because it looks like a contradiction, but if you look at context, you see that it's not. It's not a contradiction. It's translations that have not made interpretive decisions. We have to use context when we translate. When the Bible says wine is a blessing, it's talking about the fruit of the vine. It's talking about the grapes or grape juice or whatever. It's talking about wine as a mocker. It's talking about alcoholic wine, fermented wine. Paul tells the Ephesians to not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery. Instead, they're to be filled by means of God's Spirit. Every once in a while, you hear about a pastor who's had problems with alcohol. It's vital that pastors not be given to wine. Robert Yarbrough, he writes a few commentaries, lengthy commentaries. He writes a commentary on the pastoral epistles. He's not bad. I enjoy reading him. Sometimes you could get a little bogged down in the details and start getting lost, start losing the big picture. But all in all, he writes very, very well. And he writes this, Robert Yarbrough: "The perils of intoxication are graphically depicted in Scripture. They have no place in the life of an overseer or any other serious disciple of Jesus, for that matter." And so a biblically qualified pastor is not addicted to wine. The next disqualifier is that he's not pugnacious, but gentle. Now, I don't love the New American Standard Translation here, pugnacious. I don't love that. Who even knows what that means? Who before today is like, I know, Joe's like me, I think just me, probably. Anyone else know what pugnacious, Paul, maybe? A couple guys. I didn't know what's pugnacious? That's not a word. Who's this? Little Jimmy's being pugnacious, right? Don't be so pugnacious. Like, it's not, we don't use that word, right? Who is pugnacious a part of anyone here's vocabulary? 1, 2, 3 people out of however many people that are here. It wasn't part of mine. I actually like the ESV translation at this point. Actually, I like the ESV translation in most of the chapter. It's very clear, very easy to understand most of the chapter. Not pugnacious means not violent. An overseer should be led by the Spirit of God. Therefore, he should not be a violent person. King James says no striker, I believe. No striker. He's not violent. He's not belligerent. Rather, he is gentle. So he is not pugnacious, but gentle. He's not violent, but gentle. And that's not talking about physical gentleness. It's not talking about a guy having a soft touch or gently holding his wife. It's talking about patience. It's talking about gentleness of character. It's talking about consideration. He's an actively considerate person. Yarbrough writes about that word, and he says this. He says, gentle can conjure up the picture of a weak leader who blandly accepts whatever happens with a helpless smile. Neither Jesus nor Paul are depicted this way in New Testament writings. So don't be mistaken as to what gentle is. The pastor should not be a weak person. He's a person who, in chapter 6 and verse 12, must fight the good fight of the faith. In 2 Timothy 4:2, he's required to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. He's told in Titus 2:15 to exhort and reprove with all authority. He's to, in 1 Timothy 4:13, give attention to exhortation and teaching. He's called upon to boldly proclaim God's truth, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort. He's called to let no one disregard him in Titus 3:15. And so we're not talking about a weak person here. We're talking about a reasonable person. A person who's not quick-tempered, but a person who acts in it with his mind, not his feelings. A violent person acts based on his feelings. He reacts. A godly person acts on the basis of principle. Now, I hope you guys downloaded the chart I sent to you guys. If you didn't, what can I say? If you did, if you could pull up that chart, that point of choice chart that I sent you guys. Dr. Sam Harbin gave me this in a counseling class. I don't remember if it was marriage and family counseling or counseling principles or counseling problems. I don't remember. Maybe it was all of them. But he gave us this chart. And if you look at the chart, you'll see kind of a dotted line in the chart. Now, if you see the scribble on there, that's just my handwriting. All the scribbling is my handwriting. And I'm writing, that's as neat as I will ever write. Okay, because I figured one day I'm not going to understand the context of my writing. So I need to write super neat in seminary. Well, anyway, at the bottom of that chart, you see that big heart and you see the dotted line. Everything south of that dotted line, that's all the inner man. That's all what's going on underneath. That's not my actions. That's my attitude, my thoughts, even my emotions for that matter. Everything above that dotted line is what I do, right? Like my actions. So you'll see here, I can make an easy choice. If you go off to the right on that chart, I make the easy choice, which is feeling oriented. And it leads to a hard life because I'm not walking with God. And it glorifies myself. Or I can make the hard choice, right we're at that point of choice. I can make the hard decision, which is not feeling oriented, it is principle oriented. So the decision is not based on how I'm feeling, it's based on the principles of the Word of God. That ultimately leads to an easier life, that is because, I'm under God's will, and it glorifies God. So I can make a feeling-oriented decision, I can make a principle-oriented decision that's based on God's will, puts me within the will of God. The pastor needs to be a person who makes hard choices that are principle-oriented regardless of how he feels. He needs to make the hard choices that are principle-oriented regardless of perhaps sometimes what he wants. Easy choices that are feeling-oriented, like that are based in anger. Pastor can't do that. Pastor's called to make those principled choices, reasoned choices, not violent, but gentle. Some years back, I had a conversation with a pastor who is a striker. And, he leads a fairly large congregation. And in my conversation with him, he was completely unable to control his temper. I mean, this guy was a brawler. He was ready to go. So his people think he's a great guy, but he is a striker. He's not qualified to be in ministry because of his temper and because of his lack of training. But most people in America today, they don't really care about training. They just care about someone who's dynamic. If the guy's dynamic, if he has a strong, outgoing personality, that's what we want. We want a guy who's interesting, who can entertain us. And so the biblically qualified pastor is not addicted to wine. He's not violent, not pugnacious, not violent, but gentle. The next disqualifier in verse 3 is that he is peaceful, not quarrelsome. Now, this is kind of related to what we just talked about. King James says, no brawler, not a brawler. But this isn't talking about physical fighting. It's talking about a person who's contentious. Pastors don't get bogged down, as one guy says. Pastors don't get bogged down in petty controversy. Now, I personally know why this is a qualification. How do I know this? Because people get bogged down in petty things. They make mountains out of molehills, and they expect their pastor to agree with them on every little thing. Every little molehill becomes that mountain. And if the pastor doesn't agree with them, they make the thing an issue. They make the thing a distraction. They get more and more disgruntled, and they ultimately leave. Some months back, we were dealing with all the controversies that were surrounding the virus. And I think to a certain extent, we're probably still dealing with it today a little bit. But pastors cannot get bogged down with all these controversies and all the speculations. They must rather preach what God says. Paul's already written that in 1 Timothy 1, 6 and 7, that certain persons have wandered away into, listen to this, vain discussions, useless discussions, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they're saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. They're desiring to be teachers. They've been carried away by these useless discussions. They desire to be teachers, and they don't even know what they're talking about. Paul will write to Titus in Titus 3, verses 9 through 11. He'll write these words, "But avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. Reject a divisive man after the first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned." Pastors are to put away these compromising, really, they're put in these situations where people, how do I put this with grace? We are constantly bombarded with distraction. Things that people think are important and are not. I like what George and I spoke of. George, I bet you it was about 8 years ago. We had that conversation. You were working out on the porch 7, 8 years ago. And I was dealing with a particularly high amount of these types of things. And I don't remember how it came about, but the language was, when we get to heaven and we stand before Jesus Christ, will these things matter? And it was so clear that the things didn't matter. But they did matter to so many people. And that often is the case. Oftentimes, you're put in a situation where people care about things that just don't matter. They just don't matter. And so pastors are put in these situations, these positions, and if they're quarrelsome, they'll be distracted from the ministry. I've sent many a text or email or left many a voicemail that says, I'm sorry, I can't be distracted with this stuff. And I'm trying to be nice when I say it, but I just can't be distracted with the pointless stuff, with the meaningless stuff. And I'm always dodging quarrelsome issues. Again, you wouldn't believe what people care about and how they can't let it go, and how they push for these issues. It's 2 Timothy 2. I was reading this morning. 2 Timothy 2:14. I read through 2 Timothy 2, 5 times this morning. And it says this: remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. The very next verse is, study to shew thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing, accurately handling the word of truth. Proverbs 20 and verse 3 says, keeping away from strife is an honor for a man, but any fool will quarrel. The overseer must not be quarrelsome. He needs to be a person who loves peace. He needs to model that for his congregation. At the same time, he does need to point out error. He is to reprove and rebuke. And so there's kind of this tricky line that you have to really walk on as a pastor. A delicate balance is the language I like to use. And so a biblically qualified pastor is not addicted to wine. He is not violent, but gentle. He's peaceful, not quarrelsome. The next disqualifier is that he is free from the love of money. Look at the passage there. He is free from the love of money. People in positions of authority need to be trustworthy when it comes to money. Why? Because people in positions of authority can take advantage of other people. They certainly can. Spiritual leaders can take advantage of people spiritually and financially. How many so-called spiritual leaders I've watched on television manipulate people into their finances, into giving financially. For every $1 you send, you'll be blessed with more. For every $100 you spend, you'll be blessed with even more. For every 1,000, come on. If a pastor is given to the love of money, it will affect his ministry. He'll make decisions purely on the basis of money. He'll sin in order to gain more money. Every year we come around to the time to deal with the budget. And we have a finance committee. Our Constitution calls for a finance committee. And there are times where I'll talk to the finance committee and I'll say, guys, I can't make this decision because I'm torn between the selfishness of this thing or the good of the church, and I can't make it. You guys need to make it. And every year we do that with my salary. I put that completely in their hands. I've got nothing to do with it. The only thing, we work through the whole budget. At the end of the budget, I'll say, send me the final amount, and that's when I'll find out what they're recommending that I should make that year. But too many pastors will sin in order to gain more money. Some pastors are in the ministry for what they can gain. And TV preachers are a perfect example of this. I once heard Benny Hinn say something like, God is calling us to San Diego, which means Saint Diego. God is calling us to San Diego. But if we don't sell enough tickets, then God won't call us there. And we won't be able to come. Oh, is that how, that's how God works, huh? Must have missed that one in the scriptures. Must have missed that one. Must have missed it in the early chapters of Acts. I'll have to take another look. Mr. Hinn, who by the way, in the last year admitted that the prosperity gospel was a fraud, which he's done like 4 or 5 times throughout his ministry, but he keeps going. He's like a dog that returns to his own vomit. He vomits up the prosperity gospel, and then he recognizes that it's false, but then he's like, I want to get me some of that money. And he goes right back to it. Pastors need to be trustworthy with money. A local pastor apparently had some things to say about this. When he was asked about the finances of his church, he reportedly said, "Leave that to me. I'll handle it. Leave the money. Don't you worry about the finances of the church. Don't you worry about the money. I'll handle it." If you hear that from a pastor, you run. Run, Forrest. Just run. Don't even look back. Run. Run to the next church. If you're listening online, run here. Okay, this is the place. It is a disqualification. Pastors are overseers. They oversee all aspects of the ministry with primary emphasis on spiritual matters. Again, the budget's something that he does need to oversee at some level. Nevertheless, he is not to control the money. He should not know. The pastor should not know what people are giving. If the pastor knows what people are giving, you realize the temptation that would be to show favoritism? If you know someone's given, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000, you know someone else is given $10, the temptation would be to show favoritism to the guy that gives more money. I don't know what people give. I don't want to know. And the church should be transparent in how they use funds. That's part of the reason why we put out financial statements every month. By the way, if anybody wants a copy of, we always put those out, we put them out on the bulletin board here. If anybody wants a copy of the recent financial statements, email either the financial secretary, that's Paul Macker, you could send Calvary Stroudsburg Deacons at gmail.com. I guess I shouldn't be saying this online, right? I don't know, whatever. If we know you, we'll send you the financial statements. We're not going to just send them to some stranger who's asking for them. But anyone in the church, you can request those and we will get those for you. We could send it to you today, right? Paul will later write this, 1 Timothy 6, 10 through 12. And we'll spend some time looking at this passage in a few months. "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight of the faith." Money can lead people astray. When you come into some dollars, it has a powerful effect. The first couple of years I had my company, I came into some dollars and I started thinking, man, I could do some things with this. I can live a life like I want. I can have the cars I like. I can pay my house off in so many years. I can go on vacations. It can be tempting. People choose their colleges and careers on the basis of money. They'll choose how they spend half of their waking hours on the basis of money. And Titus 1:7, Paul will write that the overseer must not be fond of sordid gain. Sordid gain is dishonest gain. It could be translated, he must not be shamelessly greedy for money. Pastor needs to be free from the trappings of money. He needs to be able to support himself, sure. And Paul will write about that later. Paul will write about a person who preaches the gospel ought to be supported by the gospel. So don't be one of those guys who's always trying to reduce the pastor's salary, right? But by the way, I think our church is fantastic when it comes to this. We have a good mindset, but there are those guys in churches who they're always voting no on the church budget. And the only reason why is because they want to reduce the pastor's salary. Don't be that guy. Don't be the guy who wants the pastor to live in poverty. Don't be the guy who, like I was asked, what's the least amount of money you would take to take this job? It's like, don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. You just expose yourself is all you do. You expose yourself. Our church has been very good in this area. At times I've had to ask our finance committee not to give me raise. You know, they're always trying to give like a cost of living adjustment. And I remember one time I said, please don't do it. And they disregarded me. I said, please don't please don't give me any raise or any adjustment this year. And they went and they found some way to put money on that year's budget just to give me what they thought I should be making for the following year. So our guys have been fantastic with that. I did fight with them a little bit about that. I'm not going to like wrestle them to the ground if they're they're doing it. But the writer of Hebrews writes about the love of money. Listen to this. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money. Being content with what you have. That can be a struggle sometimes. Right? Who here has struggled at times with contentment? You see the nice shiny thing. We've all experienced that, right? And we all experience seasons of that. Contentment. We have struggles with that. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, so that we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? Our character should be free from the love of money, and that's accomplished through contentment. We can be content with what we have, and we can be content because we have the presence of Jesus Christ. It's when we stop being content with Jesus Christ, when we start becoming tempted with all these other things. Often the case. Now, I should mention that there is a difference between greed and wisdom. There's a difference between being cheap and being frugal. I'm frugal. It's different than being cheap. But anyway, we're called to handle our money wisely. Pastors are not exempt from that charge. And so a pastor should be prudent with his money. He should know how to handle money in a God-honoring way. If he can't handle his finances, he probably shouldn't be in ministry. I've known pastors who didn't even know how to read a financial report. Now, come on. You don't know how to read a financial report? You don't know how to read a profit and loss sheet or a balance sheet or a budget? You might be hearing these and saying, I don't know what those things are either. You know what they are? They're lists. That's all they are. It's a list of how much money I'm spending, what I'm spending it on, and how much money I make. That's pretty much all it is. Now, some are a little more complicated, but pretty much any one of these reports you can learn to read in a few minutes' time. I just have to know what's the list here, what's the vertical list, what's the horizontal, right? What's the list on the x-axis, what's the list on the y-axis, right? Or whatever. What is it? Columns versus rows. What's that? I just lost everybody? Okay. I look at a list, and if I can read a list, if I can write a grocery list, and I take 10 minutes to learn how to read a financial list, then I can read financial reports. If you're a pastor and you're not competent to read a list, then you're not competent to oversee a church. I've met pastors who were so focused on money that they fought with their deacons for more money. It's shameful. It's shameful for a pastor to fight for more money. Really shameful on both sides. Shameful for the pastor, and depending on the situation, could be shameful for the church or not. Pastor needs to be free from the love of money, but he also needs to be able to manage money in a godly way, and he needs to be able to recognize inappropriate ways of spending money and appropriate ways of spending it. So guys, we need to take the office of a pastor seriously. We need to consider the biblical qualifications of the office. We need to ensure that future pastors meet these qualifications. We need to hold, as a body, when I say we, that's exclusive we, that means you, okay? We even need to hold our current pastor accountable to it. I'm not saying that the pastor is accountable to any one individual within the body. Quite the opposite is true. Usually an individual is somewhat answerable to the pastor and to the church as a whole. This is all the more reason why the pastor should be biblically qualified. But the pastor is accountable to the body. The pastor is accountable. I'm accountable to our church membership. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why church membership matters. It's one of the reasons why you should be a member of a church, because the pastor is accountable to the body. The body approves and appoints the pastor, and the body is the only authority that can remove the pastor apart from God. And so we need to hold pastors accountable for these qualifications. We're not looking for perfection, but we are looking for character. At the same time, as we've been doing every week, we're holding the pastor accountable. We're considering our future pastor. If we ever need to move or leave a church or whatever, this is what I'm looking for in a pastor. We need to consider ourselves. How do you measure up in these qualifications? How do you measure up when it comes to alcohol? How do you measure up when it comes to violence? How do you measure up when it comes to being quarrelsome? Are you one of the guys? Are you one of the quarrelsome people? Are you one of the guys who's distracting the pastor with pointless things? How do you measure up when it comes to money? Is it what drives you? Is it what drives your career? Is it what drove your education and continues to drive you today? You know, I would argue that most people in this world, the default mode is that we're driven by money. I mean, think about how heavy money factors in to the job you're in. And think about whatever time or effort that you have to put in. Some guys are putting in 14, 15, 16-hour days to earn more money. Hard for me not to think that guy's not being driven by money. When you're spending 16 hours, pretty much all of your waking day working, money is a factor. Money, I would much rather. Listen, I'm gonna be honest. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. There are jobs out there, and even pastor positions out there that would pay pretty well in some very good situations. That would cause a stress demand where money isn't the most important thing. I like it here. I like that I have time to study the Word of God. I like that I'm not distracted by a day school or by a nursery or by all the various ministries or maybe businesses that a church would have. I like being the pastor of a small church because I like studying the Word of God, and I have time to do it. Anyway, don't let money be the thing that drives you. The overseer must be biblically qualified, and he must not be disqualified. He must not be disqualified when it comes to alcohol, when it comes to violence, when it comes to being quarrelsome, when it comes to money and his desire for it. Pastor must be biblically qualified in order to serve. I'm going to ask Brother Paul to come forward, lead us in hymn. I would say this: you are not qualified to even consider whether a man of God is qualified, a pastor is qualified to be a biblically qualified, if you're not even saved. If you're not saved, then you can't even understand spiritual things. And so if you're not sure you're going to heaven when you die, then come and talk to me. I'd like to share that with you. I'd like to share that gospel with you. Maybe there's self-righteousness even that's going on in your heart that you're struggling with. You know you're saved, but there's this self-righteousness where it's like, I think I'm here, but in reality, not so much. And that pride can lead you to self-righteously judge other people, even the pastor. Maybe for you, this could be a moment where it's like, I need to humble myself a little bit, and I need to repent a little bit. During this time, you can pray and handle those matters before God. Brother Paul.